Welcome to what may be one of the most disturbing yet necessary examinations of the human capacity for evil. I'm your host, Arthur Morgan, and today we're diving deep into the life, crimes, and psychology of Jeffrey Dahmer, a name that still sends chills down the spine of anyone familiar with his horrific legacy. Between 1978 and 1991, Dahmer murdered 17 young men and boys, but his crimes went far beyond murder. He engaged in necrophilia, cannibalism, and the preservation of body parts, creating a house of horrors that shocked even seasoned homicide detectives. But perhaps what's most disturbing about Jeffrey Dahmer isn't just what he did, it's how ordinary he appeared to be. Unlike the wild-eyed Charles Manson or the charming facade of Ted Bundy, Dahmer was bland and unassuming, devoid of any distinctive features that marked his monstrous deeds. When he appeared in court, spectators were driven by curiosity, eager to glimpse any sign of malevolence lurking behind his ordinary exterior. To their amazement, Dahmer didn't fit the stereotypical image of a deranged criminal. His appearance was startlingly normal. Today, we'll explore not just the crimes that made headlines, but the journey that led an apparently normal boy from affluent Bath Township, Ohio, to become one of history's most reviled killers. We'll examine his first victim, the warning signs that were missed, the systemic failures that allowed him to continue killing, and ultimately, how his reign of terror came to an end. This isn't just a story about one man's descent into evil. It's a cautionary tale about the importance of recognizing warning signs, understanding the complexity of human psychology, and confronting uncomfortable truths about violence in our society. Our story begins on June 18, 1978, with an 18-year-old boy named Stephen Hicks. Stephen had recently graduated from high school and was dealing with a tumultuous home life in Coventry Township, Ohio. Like many teenagers, he was seeking freedom and adventure. That day, he left his family home to hitchhike to a rock concert at Chippewa Lake Park, Ohio. It was a decision that would cost him his life and mark the beginning of Jeffrey Dahmer's killing spree. During his journey, Hicks encountered 18-year-old Jeffrey Dahmer, who offered him a ride and extended an invitation to his parents' home on Bath Road for a few beers. The Dahmer property was in an affluent area, a spacious, rustic ranch-style home situated on 1.7 acres of wooded land, complete with a spring-fed pond. It seemed like an innocent enough invitation. By Dahmer's admission, Hicks caught his attention because he was bare-chested. Dahmer also struggled later to recall their conversations, but remembered that the evening became intense as they consumed alcohol and engaged in sexual activities. But when Hicks expressed his intention to leave, something inside Dahmer snapped. Feeling abandoned, he reacted violently. A physical altercation ensued, and Dahmer, fearing the loss of someone in his life yet again, reached for a 10-pound dumbbell and struck Hicks twice from behind as Hicks sat on a chair. When Hicks fell unconscious, Dahmer strangled him to death with the bar of the dumbbell, then stripped the clothes from Hicks' body before exploring his chest with his hands, then masturbating as he stood above the corpse. Later confessing to Ohio police, Dahmer's explanation was chillingly simple. The guy wanted to leave, and I didn't want him to leave. Confronted with Hicks's 160-pound body, Dahmer, apparently recalling his earlier macabre experiments with animals, dragged the corpse to a crawl space under the house. There, he dismembered it using a kitchen knife and placed the remains into plastic bags. Initially, he stored the bags in his car, but then decided that burying them in the wooded area behind his home would be better. What makes this first murder particularly telling is what happened next. Dahmer left the remains to decay and served in the Army for 2 years. Upon his return, he exhumed the body, removed the flesh from Hicks' bones, and dissolved the flesh in acid before flushing the solution down the toilet. Dahmer also shattered the bones with a sledgehammer and scattered the fragments throughout the woods. He later confessed to police that he had incinerated Hicks's wallet, dismantled a necklace Hicks wore, and disposed of the murder weapon by throwing the knife into the Cuyahoga River. The methodical nature of this cover-up, the patience to wait years before destroying evidence, and the calculated disposal of personal effects, these weren't the actions of someone who killed in a moment of passion and panicked. This was the behavior of someone who understood exactly what he had done and was determined to get away with it. 13 years later, when Dahmer was finally caught, he was able to mark the exact spot on a map for Ohio investigators where he had discarded Hicks's remains. Despite being able to recall such precise details during his confession, Dahmer could only remember his first victim as a hitchhiker named Steve, describing him as a white guy around 19 years old. This selective memory, crystal clear about logistics, hazy about the human being he'd destroyed, would become a hallmark of how Dahmer related to his victims. The Hicks family never lost hope. They reported Stephen missing on June 24, 1978, and launched an investigation that involved retracing his likely path from the concert and interviewing numerous acquaintances, relatives, and friends. They offered a $2,500 reward for information leading to Stephen's return, and his details were entered into a national computer network to support efforts in locating missing persons. But Stephen Hicks was already dead, buried in pieces across the wooded acres of the Dahmer family property, while Jeffrey Dahmer learned the most dangerous lesson of his life, that he could kill and get away with it. To understand how Jeffrey Dahmer became capable of such evil, we need to go back to the beginning. Born on May 21, 1960, in Milwaukee, to Lionel Dahmer, a chemist, and Joyce Dahmer, Jeffrey spent much of his childhood in the affluent suburb of Bath Township, Ohio. This area was characterized by beautiful landscapes, riding stables, and tennis courts, a stark contrast to the dilapidated Milwaukee neighborhood where his apartment would eventually be discovered. Following the revelation of Dahmer's crimes, journalists zealously sought out early signs that might indicate a predisposition toward becoming a serial killer. Yet despite extensive inquiries involving numerous psychiatric professionals, the consensus was often that clear warning signs simply weren't present in the traditional sense. Lionel Dahmer fondly recalled moments from Jeffrey's past, such as when his son would enthusiastically dash through the house during visits from his grandparents. These memories illustrate how a father might find it challenging to disown his child regardless of their transgressions, and they remind us that Jeffrey Dahmer was not perpetually a criminal. However, there were troubling signs for those who knew where to look. By 1966, 6-year-old Jeffrey Dahmer had just started first grade at Hazel Harvey Elementary School in Barberton, Ohio. Following the birth of his younger brother David on December 18th of that year, a note from his teacher indicated that young Jeffrey seemed to feel neglected. Dahmer experienced a lack of attention during infancy. His mother was often tense, emotionally demanding, and frequently sought sympathy, while also engaging in arguments with her husband and neighbors. She was a hypochondriac and suffered from depression. On one occasion, she attempted suicide using Equinil. Neither of Dahmer's parents spent much time with him, and he later recalled feeling, from an early age, unsure of the solidity of the family. He remembered a household filled with intense tension and frequent arguments between his parents throughout his early childhood. The family moved to Bath in 1968, where Jeffrey began attending Bath Elementary School. Their new residence was that idyllic wooded property where Stephen Hicks would later die. Neighbors noted the Dahmers weren't affiliated with any church, though Jeffrey revealed during his confession that he was brought up as a Protestant before becoming an atheist, a transition that marked a significant shift in his belief system. It was during his early childhood that Jeffrey showed his first interest in science after his father gifted him an introductory chemistry set. This sparked a fascination with chemical reactions. But Jeffrey's experiments focused on insects and small animals. Neighbors recounted how he began gathering dead animals, initially collecting them like a child's collection of preserved insects stored in jars with various chemicals. Over time, his collection grew to include the bodies of animals found dead by roadside accidents. In the woods behind his family home, visitors would find gruesome sights like animal heads placed on stakes and stretched out animal hides. In his own backyard, Jeffrey created a crude animal cemetery where he interred these creatures. Disturbingly, in later years, he would scatter human remains not far from where he had buried those animals as a child. Friends from his childhood remembered Jeffrey's curiosity about animal anatomy, a curiosity he satisfied by dissecting creatures and examining how their bodies functioned beneath the skin, which he meticulously peeled away and sometimes dissolved using chemicals. On one memorable fishing trip with neighborhood friends, Jeffrey cut his caught fish into small pieces to scrutinize its internal structure. In one instance, in 1975, Dahmer decapitated a dog's carcass and nailed the body to a tree and impaled the skull upon a stick in the woodland behind his house. As a so-called prank, he later invited a friend to see the display, pretending he had stumbled upon the remains by accident. Even more unsettling was his habit of listening closely to his friends' heartbeats, pressing his ear against their chests in fascination. Sue Lair, a neighbor in Bath, recalled a memory of an innocent Jeffrey. She fondly remembered baking cookies for him and yearning to hug away his loneliness. The stark contrast between the boy she remembered and the figure shown on television in a bright orange prison jumpsuit was almost incomprehensible. This child, who once played in her backyard, participated in sledding and ball games with her son Steve, had evolved into a notorious killer. Lair highlighted that Jeffrey, as a boy, was eager to meet adult expectations, striving to fulfill what he perceived as the right actions. She speculated that this intense need to please might have indicated deeper problems. Not everyone was aware of Jeffrey's peculiar habits, the animal skinning and bone collecting. Her son Steve even trusted Jeffrey enough to take over his newspaper delivery route during vacations. Psychiatric professionals identify behaviors such as animal cruelty, attention-seeking, and vivid fantasies as early signs of potential sadistic criminal behavior. Despite such indicators, nobody recognized that young Jeffrey Dahmer needed psychological intervention at the time. There have been extensive media reports alleging that Dahmer was sexually abused at age 8. According to his probation file, Lionel Dahmer reportedly mentioned that his son had been abused by a neighbor, with the parole officer suggesting this could explain Dahmer's sexual issues. However, these claims remain unverified. Lionel Dahmer has fervently denied any such conversation with a parole officer, and Jeffrey himself did not recall any such abuse when questioned by police. What emerges from Jeffrey's childhood isn't a clear picture of abuse or neglect, but rather a portrait of a deeply isolated child whose disturbing fascinations were either overlooked or dismissed as phases he would outgrow. In retrospect, the warning signs were there, but they required someone to connect the dots between animal cruelty, social isolation, and an unhealthy fascination with death and anatomy. By 1974, when Dahmer attended Revere High School, he was contributing to his school community in several conventional ways. He played clarinet in the freshman year band, participated in intramural tennis from his sophomore to senior years, and was part of the school newspaper, The Lantern, during his junior year. Despite engaging in normal activities and maintaining average grades, classmates noticed he was a loner who maintained a peculiar fascination with dead animals and struggled to fit in. Following the revelation of his crimes in Milwaukee, former classmates came forward with their memories. Some recalled scenes where he traced body outlines on the floor with chalk, while others mentioned his heavy drinking habits. Martha Schmidt, a sociologist and peer from his high school, painted a picture of Dahmer as an individual troubled and adrift from an early age. Dahmer was depicted as someone engulfed by fantasies and estranged from his peers, leading him to act out to gain attention. He struggled with excessive drinking, intensified by pervasive loneliness and lack of familial support. He was fascinated by movies like The Exorcist III, laden with dark themes, though it remained unclear if he ever embraced satanic beliefs. He evidently sensed something was amiss within himself, demonstrated by a brief visit to the Milwaukee County Mental Health Complex, an attempt he aborted after a mere 15-minute wait. This moment represents a tragic missed opportunity, a cry for help that went unanswered. When Dahmer reached puberty, he discovered he was gay, but he did not tell his parents. In his early teens, he had a brief relationship with another teenage boy, although they never had sex. Dahmer later admitted that he began fantasizing about dominating and controlling a completely submissive male partner in his early to mid-teens, and his masturbatory fantasies eventually evolved to his focusing on chests and torsos. These fantasies then became intertwined with dissection. Members of Milwaukee's gay community speculated that Dahmer had internalized difficulties with his sexual identity. His inability to openly accept this aspect of himself likely compounded his inner turmoil. Ironically, his greatest source of self-esteem stemmed from his employment, which, upon losing, stripped him of any remaining semblance of normalcy. Dahmer confided in probation officer Donna Chester, expressing a general mistrust of people. In situations that necessitated interaction with coworkers, he often retreated into his rich fantasy world, a realm that ultimately eclipsed and replaced his reality altogether. This pattern of retreat into fantasy, combined with increasing social isolation and substance abuse, created a dangerous psychological cocktail. Dahmer was essentially rehearsing in his mind the acts he would later commit in reality, using his fantasies as both escape and preparation. The tragedy of Dahmer's adolescence isn't just that warning signs were missed. It's that at several points, there were opportunities for intervention that could have changed the trajectory of his life and saved the lives of his future victims. The brief visit to the mental health facility represents just one of these missed chances, a moment when proper psychological intervention might have identified and addressed the dark fantasies that were already taking root in his mind. Instead, Dahmer graduated from high school and was left to navigate the world with untreated psychological issues, an increasing dependence on alcohol, and a growing collection of violent fantasies that would soon demand to be made real. To truly understand the depth of Jeffrey Dahmer's depravity, we need to step inside apartment 213 at the Oxford Apartments on North 25th Street in Milwaukee. What police discovered there in July 1991 was beyond anything they had ever encountered, a museum of death that revealed the true extent of Dahmer's obsession with his victims. A deadbolt lock was securely fastened to the exterior of the sliding door, providing access to the bedroom, bathroom, and closet. This wasn't just about keeping people out. It was about keeping his secrets in. Inside the bedroom closet, a disorganized array of tools and loose wires was scattered across the floor. At the rear of the closet, a metal stock pot, notable for its size, akin to that of a lobster pot, held severely decomposed hands and a penis. Positioned on a shelf above this kettle were two human skulls. The closet also contained several containers filled with substances such as ethyl alcohol, chloroform, and formaldehyde. Accompanying these were glass jars containing male genitalia that had been preserved in formaldehyde. This wasn't the chaotic workspace of a disorganized killer. This was the methodical laboratory of someone who saw his victims as specimens to be preserved and studied. Moving to the bathroom, Dahmer had admitted to dismembering numerous victims in this very room. A photograph of a nude male was affixed next to the mirror, a reminder of his obsessions even during mundane daily activities. In the bedroom, on top of a dresser, were a television, a beer can, and a gay pornographic videotape, creating a bizarre domestic scene that masked the horror within. But it was the contents of the top dresser drawer that truly revealed Dahmer's mindset. About 30 Polaroid photos captured various stages of his victim's demise. One unsettling image depicted a man's head, with flesh still intact, situated in a sink. Another disturbing photo showed a victim whose body had been sliced from neck to groin, not unlike a deer being gutted after a kill, with cuts executed so precisely that the pelvic bone was starkly visible. A further image depicted a bleached skeleton hung within the closet, with flesh on the head, hands and feet still attached and undisturbed by decay. The photographs illustrated male bodies dissected and artfully displayed in several poses on the bed. One image showcased hands and genitals inside the stock pot found within the closet. Dahmer, perhaps perceiving himself as a macabre artist, meticulously arranged the remains for his photography endeavors. He placed a severed head with recognizable features, skin, and hair preserved atop a white cloth. The hands were methodically arranged on a folded cloth to one side of the head, while genital organs were set on a cloth opposite. In another of his disturbing setups, Dahmer placed 2 skulls side by side on a plate next to various condiments, suggesting they were stored in a kitchen cupboard. These weren't random acts of violence. They were carefully choreographed displays that served multiple purposes for Dahmer. First, they allowed him to relive the experience of killing. Second, they served as trophies of his conquests. And third, they represented his twisted attempt to maintain a connection with his victims even after death. Besides these grim images capturing his lethal activities, Dahmer also photographed his victims while they were alive. The subjects assumed various sexually explicit poses, including bondage scenarios involving handcuffs. Particularly heartbreaking was the photograph of 14-year-old Konarak Sintha Somphone, who posed wearing black bikini briefs in a bodybuilder pose. Dahmer organized these photos in a manner akin to arranging cherished vacation snapshots, intending to reminisce about those heinous moments. A computer box within the bedroom housed 2 skulls and served as storage for this photo diary, chronicling the dismembered corpses. On the walls of the bedroom, photographs of male bodybuilders were conspicuously displayed, revealing his physical preferences and the type of victims he sought. A 2-drawer metal file cabinet contained 3 skulls in the top drawer, while the bottom drawer held an assortment of bones. Scattered across the floor were numerous pornographic videotapes. This apartment wasn't just where Dahmer lived. It was his private museum, his trophy room, and his fantasy world made real. Every item had significance. Every preserved part served a purpose in his twisted psychology. He had created a space where he could be surrounded by his victims indefinitely, where death became a form of permanent possession. The methodical organization, the careful preservation, the artistic arrangement, all of this points to a mind that saw murder not as an end, but as a beginning. For Dahmer, killing his victims was just the first step in a longer process of ownership and control that could continue indefinitely through preservation and photography. This physical evidence reveals perhaps the most disturbing aspect of Dahmer's psychology: his complete inability to see his victims as human beings with their own agency and desires. To him, they were objects to be collected, preserved, and displayed, trophies in a game where he was the only player who mattered. To understand how Jeffrey Dahmer operated and selected his victims, we need to examine one case that breaks his usual pattern: the murder of David Thomas in September 1990. This case is particularly revealing because it shows how Dahmer's compulsions could override even his own preferences. Dahmer encountered 22-year-old David Thomas near the C'est La Vie gay bar in Milwaukee. Following his usual method, he persuaded Thomas to return to his apartment by offering him money. Within the confines of his apartment, they conversed and drank. But unlike with most of his victims, engaging in sexual activities was not part of their interaction. This is where the Thomas case becomes crucial to understanding Dahmer's psychology. He administered a drug-laced drink to Thomas, then killed and dismembered him, despite having no sexual desire toward him. When asked why, Dahmer's explanation was chillingly pragmatic. He feared that Thomas would be furious upon waking and discovering what had happened. Dahmer explained to Detective Kennedy that since Thomas didn't fit his usual preference for victims, he decided not to retain any parts of his body. This cold calculation, that some victims were worth preserving while others were merely disposed of, reveals the depth of Dahmer's dehumanization of his victims. Nonetheless, he took photographs of Thomas during the dismemberment process, maintaining his ritual of documentation even when the victim didn't meet his typical criteria. Leslie Thomas, David's sister, would later identify her brother by recognizing his face in these horrific photographs. David Thomas's disappearance was reported by his girlfriend, Chandra Beanland, on September 24, 1990. They shared a 3-year-old daughter named Cortia. Like relatives of other victims, Beanland noted that it wasn't uncommon for David to be absent for extended periods, typically away for 2 or 3 weeks before contacting family and returning home. David Thomas had an extensive criminal record with 13 different aliases, 5 arrests for battery, 16 for retail theft or shoplifting, several for obstructing police officers, attempted armed robbery, and assault. He had spent nearly 6 months in jail and had violated probation terms just 5 months before encountering Dahmer. Ironically, on the same day Thomas was reported missing, police records show that Dahmer himself was the victim of an armed robbery near North 27th Street and West Wisconsin Avenue. Around 8:20 p.m., Dahmer was confronted by 2 men who demanded money. After he refused, one threatened him with a gun, and they managed to steal $10 and a bus pass before returning his wallet and escaping. This marked the 3rd time Dahmer had been victimized by robbery since being on probation. From September 1990 to February 1991, Dahmer experienced a period of relative quiet regarding murders. During this time, he exhibited chronic depression and participated in alcohol and mental health treatment programs with little evidence of progress. At one facility, he was diagnosed with manic depressive disorder. According to probation officer reports, while Dahmer's physical appearance showed signs of improvement, his outlook remained bleak and negative. He was characterized as a chronic complainer with extravagant spending habits who harbored resentment toward affluent individuals, often questioning their luck and expressing hatred for their wealth. The David Thomas case illustrates several crucial aspects of Dahmer's psychology. First, his compulsion to kill had become so strong that it overrode his sexual preferences. He killed Thomas not out of desire, but out of convenience and fear of discovery. Second, his ability to categorize victims as worthy or unworthy of preservation shows his complete objectification of human beings. And third, his continued documentation of the crime through photography reveals his need to maintain control and ownership over the experience, even when the victim held no particular appeal for him. This case also highlights how Dahmer's crimes might have been detected earlier. Thomas had an extensive criminal record and regular contact with law enforcement. His girlfriend reported him missing. Yet the connection to Dahmer wasn't made until much later, partly because Thomas didn't fit the profile of Dahmer's typical victims, and partly because of systemic failures in missing persons investigations, particularly when the victims came from marginalized communities. The Thomas murder shows us Dahmer at his most coldly calculating, killing not in the heat of passion or overwhelming compulsion, but as a practical solution to a problem he had created for himself. It reveals a level of premeditation and callousness that makes his crimes all the more chilling. 13 years after Stephen Hicks vanished while hitchhiking to a rock concert, his family's long nightmare took a crucial turn. The discovery of Jeffrey Dahmer's gruesome crimes in his Milwaukee apartment prompted Ohio authorities to investigate whether Dahmer might be connected to any cold cases in their jurisdiction. The breakthrough came when Milwaukee police reached out to their Ohio counterparts to check for any reports of missing hitchhikers from 1978, the year Dahmer admitted to killing a hitchhiker. 2 Ohio law enforcement officials, Bath Police Lieutenant Richard Muncie and Summit County Sheriff's Department Detective John Karabatsos, traveled to Milwaukee to interview Dahmer about Hicks's disappearance. When shown a photograph of Stephen Hicks, Dahmer acknowledged him with a detached demeanor similar to when he identified his other 16 victims. He reportedly affirmed to Ohio police, "Yeah, that's him," when presented with Hicks's image. This cold recognition led to formal charges of aggravated murder being filed against Dahmer on September 17, 1991. But identifying the killer was only the beginning. The Hicks family needed closure, and that meant finding Stephen's remains. Guided by Dahmer's own map detailing where he had disposed of the body, a massive investigation unfolded at the Bath, Ohio property where Dahmer had grown up. The search effort was extraordinary in its scope and scientific precision. About 24 technicians and law enforcement officials initiated a comprehensive search, enhanced by expertise from prominent anthropologists from nearby Kent State University and even the Smithsonian Institution in Washington, D.C. This wasn't just a criminal investigation, it was an archaeological excavation. The authorities sectioned off the entire 1.7-acre lot into a grid for systematic searching. They deployed metal detectors to locate any teeth with fillings and used luminol to reveal traces of blood, even blood that had been there for over a decade. The search extended to the dirt floor crawl space under the house, the same space where young Jeffrey had once played and where he would later confess to temporarily storing Hicks's dismembered body. As investigators meticulously sifted through soil with screens to uncover bone fragments, they relied heavily on DNA technology, which in 1991 was still a relatively novel approach to solving cases. For this purpose, a treasured childhood photo album containing a lock of Stephen Hicks's hair, preserved by his parents Martha and Richard Hicks, proved essential. The hair sample provided a basis for genetic comparison, supplemented by blood samples from Hicks's parents. The investigative techniques required cleansing and pulverizing bone fragments to extract uncontaminated DNA for testing. As the investigation progressed, a chilling array of evidence emerged that corroborated Dahmer's confession in horrifying detail. Hundreds of bone fragments and traces of dried blood were discovered throughout the property. Perhaps most disturbing was a bloody handprint found on the cinder block wall of the crawl space, a stark reminder of the violence that had occurred in that confined space 13 years earlier. Detectives also uncovered damaged rocks behind the home, marked by sledgehammer blows, consistent with Dahmer's confession of using the tool to obliterate Hicks's bones before scattering them in the woods. The thoroughness of this investigation allowed Stephen Hicks's family to finally hold a funeral service in October 1991. However, the process didn't end there, as 2 pieces of his skeleton remained at the Smithsonian Institution for final identification. In the midst of this grim closure, the Hicks family issued a public statement expressing the deep emotional turmoil they had endured. They reflected on the complexity of their son's life and the unexplainable evil manifested in Dahmer's actions. Richard Hicks voiced his profound disdain for Dahmer, telling the Akron Beacon-Journal that he viewed him not as insane, but as inherently evil. In a poignant moment of resolve, the Hicks family expressed their desire for privacy as they laid their son to rest, acknowledging the impossibility of fully understanding the motives behind such a heinous act, yet grateful for the opportunity to finally say goodbye. On September 14, 1991, the remains of Stephen Hicks were returned to his grieving family. The pain of their long journey was marked by their efforts to piece together a semblance of peace and closure from the wreckage left by Jeffrey Dahmer's malevolence. The Hicks case represents both the best and worst of criminal investigation. The family's 13-year wait for answers illustrates how difficult it can be to solve cases when victims come from transient populations like hitchhikers. But the eventual resolution shows how persistence, scientific advancement, and interagency cooperation can bring justice even in the most challenging cases. For the Hicks family, finding Stephen's remains was both an ending and a beginning, the end of 13 years of uncertainty and the beginning of their ability to properly grieve and memorialize their son. It was a reminder that behind every statistic, every case number, every victim's name, there's a family that never stops hoping for answers. After his arrest in July 1991, Jeffrey Dahmer provided investigators with a chilling confession that offered unprecedented insight into the mind of a serial killer. His willingness to detail his crimes was unusual. Most killers either deny everything or provide minimal information. Dahmer, however, seemed almost relieved to finally tell his story. In his confession, Dahmer provided insights into his early life and delved into the grisly details of his crimes with disturbing detachment. Growing up in Ohio, he recalled the event when, at age 18, he picked up the hitchhiker who became his first murder victim. Following his 2-year stint in the Army, Dahmer relocated to Miami, claiming he did not engage in any murderous activities there. Remarkably candid, Dahmer shifted from discussing his atheistic views and childhood to matter-of-factly admitting to being both a murderer and a cannibal. He downplayed his criminal record, simplifying it to just an incident involving Polaroid photographs of a minor, though the reality included charges of second-degree sexual assault and enticement of a child for immoral purposes. During his time in West Allis, Wisconsin, living with his grandmother, Dahmer used a gray-handled sledgehammer from her garage to crush the bones of his victims. This sledgehammer was later found by police during a search of Catherine Dahmer's home, and Jeffrey identified it as the tool he had used for dismembering bodies at his grandmother's residence. The media's curiosity about Dahmer's cannibalistic acts was intense. Official confirmation was initially elusive, and it was only through a report leaked by a janitor from the district attorney's office to the New York Times that the public first learned of his cannibalism. Even after the report was published, authorities refrained from confirming these details until journalists obtained copies of the confession independently. According to Dahmer's confession, he admitted to consuming human body parts only once. He described to detectives how he ate the biceps of one of his victims because it was large and he had a desire to try it. This clinical description, delivered without emotion or remorse, illustrates the complete disconnection Dahmer felt from the humanity of his actions. Dahmer also revealed that he would masturbate in front of the severed parts and skulls he collected, as they brought back memories of his victims. He explained his choice of gay men as victims, saying he wanted to be with them, emphasizing that all were gay. Dahmer felt that by killing them and preserving their skulls, he could keep a connection to them, especially the ones he found handsome. This reveals perhaps the most disturbing aspect of Dahmer's psychology, his inability to understand that relationships require mutual consent and participation. In his twisted mind, killing someone was a way of ensuring they could never leave him, and preserving their remains was a form of eternal companionship. Dahmer recounted the gruesome details of his crimes with disturbing detachment, including the fate of his last 3 victims whose flesh remained intact as their heads were stored in his refrigerator and freezer. The methodical way he described dismemberment procedures, chemical preservation techniques, and disposal methods revealed someone who had refined his process through repeated practice. After narrating his crimes without apparent emotion, his detailed 4-page confession was documented. Dahmer reviewed the confession, initialing each page before signing it. When offered food afterward, he declined, stating a lack of appetite. He expressed a desire to discuss the murders further. Later that same Tuesday, Dahmer requested that Detectives Kennedy and Murphy return to his jail cell so he could provide additional information about other murders that had slipped his mind. In a statement to the detectives, he candidly remarked, "I've told you everything already. I have nothing to hide, so I might as well tell you about these murders I forgot." This casual mention of forgotten murders illustrates how completely Dahmer had dehumanized his victims. They weren't people whose deaths would naturally be memorable. They were simply items in an inventory that he occasionally misplaced in his mental accounting. Following his exhaustive confession, Dahmer was led to a jail cell within the police administration building. As news spread, he quickly became an object of fascination for officers at the precinct, who were morbidly intrigued by the extent and nature of his heinous acts. The confession revealed someone who was simultaneously deeply disturbed and methodically rational. Dahmer understood the mechanics of what he was doing, could articulate his motivations clearly, and had developed increasingly sophisticated techniques for achieving his goals. This wasn't the ranting of a madman. It was the careful explanation of someone who had turned murder and necrophilia into a systematic practice. Perhaps most chilling was Dahmer's apparent relief at finally being caught. His willingness to provide detailed confessions, his cooperation with investigators, and his additional volunteering of forgotten crimes suggest someone who had been carrying an enormous psychological burden. In some twisted way, his arrest may have been the first genuine human connection he had experienced in years. Finally, someone was listening to his story, even if it was a story of unimaginable horror. The Dahmer case didn't just expose the failures of law enforcement and mental health systems. It also revealed significant problems with how the media covers crimes, particularly when those crimes involve marginalized communities. The coverage of Dahmer's murders became a case study in journalistic blind spots and the importance of diverse newsroom representation. The racial dimension of Dahmer's crimes was unmistakable. Most of the remains discovered belonged to black men. Yet in Milwaukee, like many cities across the country, the media industry was predominantly managed and staffed by white individuals. In 1991, the Milwaukee Journal had approximately 200 reporters, of which only 12 were black. Eugene Kane, a black columnist and feature writer for the Milwaukee Journal, voiced concerns over the inadequate initial coverage concerning race in the Dahmer case. Writing in the newsletter of the National Association of Black Journalists, Kane stressed the significant omission in acknowledging the racial aspects of Dahmer's crimes. Ira J. Hadnot, a black assistant metropolitan editor at the Journal, also criticized the white-dominated media for their handling of the Dahmer story. He noted that initial reporting failed to adequately incorporate perspectives from minority and gay communities, which he considered a major oversight. Hadnot pointed out that the newsroom itself was indicative of broader societal issues, lacking adequate representation from minority communities across various professional sectors. Kane joined in criticizing television and radio for their initial failure to address racial dimensions adequately. He observed that white reporters were preoccupied with sensationalizing the story of a mass murderer, neglecting racial considerations in their coverage. This wasn't just about missing details. It was about missing the entire context that made Dahmer's victim selection possible. The gay community experienced a particular affront during the media frenzy surrounding the Dahmer story, due to the use of the term homosexual overkill by several officials in describing the murders. This expression was vehemently opposed by both black and gay communities, as it appeared to conflate homosexuality with serial killing, suggesting an unwarranted connection between the two. Kane highlighted arguments from Mark Rochester, one of only 3 black reporters on the journal's metropolitan desk at the onset of the Dahmer case. Rochester indicated that black reporters had alerted editors about the inappropriate use of homosexual overkill, pointing out that there was no substantial evidence linking sexual orientation as the motive behind the murders. As minority reporters, Rochester and his colleagues demonstrated greater sensitivity to the offense the term posed to the gay community compared to other newsroom staff. This highlights how diverse perspectives in journalism aren't just about fairness. They're about accuracy and avoiding harmful mischaracterizations. Through his analysis, Kane emphasized the need for the journal newsroom to improve its approach to covering racial issues, using the Dahmer case as a lesson. He argued that without more diverse representation in journalism, stories like Dahmer's would continue to catch the media unprepared in dealing with sensitive topics. Terry Bowner, publisher of the Wisconsin Light, a newspaper dedicated to the gay community across the state, concurred with Kane's assessment. Bowner asserted that only someone intimately familiar with the gay community, possibly through personal experience as a gay or lesbian individual, could provide the depth of coverage needed to do justice to the story. There were many aspects and subtleties of community lifestyle that outsiders could easily overlook. The bars where Dahmer met his victims, the social dynamics within Milwaukee's gay community, the particular vulnerabilities that made certain individuals easier targets. These were stories that required insider knowledge to tell accurately. Consequently, Bowner stressed the importance of having community members narrate their own stories, a sentiment that had not yet been realized in coverage of how the Dahmer case impacted the gay community. This wasn't just about representation. It was about ensuring that the full human impact of Dahmer's crimes was understood and documented. The media coverage of the Dahmer case became a turning point in discussions about newsroom diversity and community representation. It demonstrated that when newsrooms lack diverse voices, they don't just miss stories, they miss entire communities whose experiences and perspectives are essential to understanding major events. The failures in covering the racial and sexual aspects of the Dahmer case weren't just journalistic shortcomings. They were manifestations of broader social problems about whose stories get told, whose perspectives matter, and whose pain gets acknowledged. In many ways, the media's initial blind spots mirrored some of the same systemic issues that allowed Dahmer to continue killing for so long. The tendency to overlook or minimize violence against marginalized communities. When filmmakers choose to portray serial killers, they typically focus on the gruesome aspects of their crimes, reenacting murders in graphic detail with intense scores designed to instill fear. These biographical films sometimes touch upon early lives, but generally emphasize monstrous deeds and the terror inflicted. However, the 2017 film My Friend Dahmer offered a fundamentally different approach to understanding Jeffrey Dahmer. Based on the 2012 graphic novel by John Backderf, a childhood friend of Dahmer, My Friend Dahmer film recounts their friendship during their teen years in suburban Ohio in the 1970s. This film is less about the heinous acts Dahmer eventually committed and more about exploring the factors that contributed to the making of a murderer. The film provides an unsettling perspective on the gradual unraveling of a seemingly average teenager, making it all the more chilling because audiences already know the devastating outcome. It's a study in how evil can develop within apparent normalcy and how warning signs can be missed or misinterpreted by those closest to someone who's developing dangerous psychological patterns. During his high school years, Jeffrey Dahmer was often perceived as a loner who led a considerably average home life. While there was tension between his parents, it wasn't characterized by the severe abuse or extreme poverty often seen in the backgrounds of many serial killers. Nonetheless, there was something noticeably off about him. Dahmer had that peculiar fascination with experimenting on animal bones in a shed and harbored sexual fantasies that were disturbingly intertwined with death. As an adult, in his macabre pursuit to create zombies, he would drill crude holes into some of his victims' skulls, attempting to inject muriatic acid, a method that ultimately proved unsuccessful, but revealed his desire for complete control over another human being. The film showcases Dahmer's life at school, where he manages to find a circle of friends despite his nerdy demeanor. He connects with other fringe students, including aspiring artist John Backdorf, portrayed by Alex Wolff. Together with their peers, Dahmer, played by Ross Lynch, engages in typical teenage pranks and mischief. Yet as viewers know, he is far from typical. This portrayal is particularly effective because it shows how Dahmer could function in social situations when it served his needs. He wasn't a complete social outcast. He had friends, participated in school activities, and could appear relatively normal when necessary. This ability to mask his true nature would later serve him well when luring victims. The film concludes with Dahmer's first murder, that of hitchhiker Stephen Hicks, occurring just weeks after his high school graduation. This marks his transformation into the infamous Jeffrey Dahmer known today. Much like other serial killers, Dahmer alluded to influences beyond himself, such as supernatural elements, which may explain his obsession with The Exorcist and its sequels. My Friend Dahmer provides a unique insight into the psyche of a serial killer by exploring the complex layers of his formative years. It raises uncomfortable questions about how we identify potential threats, support troubled individuals, and prevent the development of violent behavior. The film's power lies in its restraint. By focusing on the person Dahmer was before he became a killer, it forces viewers to confront the reality that monsters aren't born fully formed. They develop over time, often in plain sight. The film suggests that with proper intervention, recognition of warning signs, and adequate mental health support, the trajectory might have been different. This perspective is important because it moves beyond the sensationalism that often surrounds serial killer narratives. Instead of focusing on the spectacle of violence, My Friend Dahmer examines the human factors that contributed to that violence. It's a reminder that understanding how someone becomes capable of evil is crucial to preventing future tragedies. The film also highlights the missed opportunities that existed throughout Dahmer's adolescence. His friends noticed his strange behavior, but dismissed it as typical teenage oddness. Teachers saw his acting out, but didn't recognize it as a cry for help. Family members observed his increasing isolation and drinking, but didn't connect these behaviors to deeper psychological problems. My Friend Dahmer serves as both a character study and a cautionary tale, demonstrating that the path to becoming a serial killer often involves numerous points where intervention might have made a difference. It's a sobering reminder that the capacity for evil can develop within seemingly ordinary circumstances, and that recognizing and addressing warning signs is everyone's responsibility. Understanding the gravity of his actions, Jeffrey Dahmer accepted the harsh reality of his forthcoming imprisonment. Unlike many killers who maintain their innocence or blame others for their actions, Dahmer expressed his culpability and did not expect leniency. He communicated his readiness to face the maximum legal consequences. Consequently, he was sentenced by the court to 15 consecutive life terms, equating to 957 years behind bars. From the perspective of his former defense attorney, Gerald Boyle, Dahmer was a marked man the moment he left the courthouse. Boyle anticipated that Dahmer would not survive long in prison, predicting his demise within the first couple of years. His prediction proved eerily accurate. In just over 2 years, Dahmer was killed by fellow inmate Christopher Scarver at the Columbia Correctional Institution in Portage, Wisconsin. The incident occurred on November 28, 1994, while Dahmer and another inmate, Jesse Anderson, were cleaning a restroom under minimal supervision. Scarver, already serving a life sentence for murdering his work supervisor in 1990, attacked both men with a 20-inch metal bar from the prison's weight room. Anderson, like Dahmer, was serving time for a heinous crime. He had killed his wife but falsely accused 2 black men of the act. Both inmates' deaths elicited little sympathy from the public. The attack happened quickly and brutally. Scarver later claimed that Dahmer's behavior in prison, including his tendency to fashion his food into body parts and leave them where other inmates would find them, had disturbed and angered him. Whether this was genuine motivation or post hoc rationalization, it highlighted how Dahmer's psychological disturbance continued to manifest even in prison. Photographic evidence of the metal bar used in the murders was examined by a commission led by the governor to ensure there was no negligence from prison staff during the fatal incident. The commission concluded that neither guards nor inmates witnessed the attack, a claim they all maintained. This raised questions about prison supervision and whether adequate measures were in place to protect high-profile inmates. Years after the deaths, in 2001, a bizarre incident surfaced involving a prison guard suspected of attempting to auction Dahmer's personal items, including a shaving kit and grooming tools, OP, on eBay. The attempt was discovered in time, and the items, after garnering a high bid of $20.50, were returned to the Columbia County Sheriff's Office. This incident highlighted the continuing morbid fascination with Dahmer and the lengths to which some people would go to profit from his notoriety. Christopher Scarver, who is now serving 3 life sentences in a maximum security facility in Colorado, occupies his time by publishing poetry on his website. The irony that Dahmer's killer has found creative expression, while Dahmer found only destruction, is not lost on those who study criminal psychology. Even after his legal representation officially ended, Gerald Boyle continued to visit Jeffrey Dahmer in prison. Boyle advocated that Dahmer would have been better suited to a psychiatric institution, such as the Mendota Mental Health Institute in Madison, Wisconsin. He believed that valuable insights could have been gleaned from studying Dahmer's psychological condition, potentially aiding in the treatment of other adolescents struggling with mental health issues who might be inclined toward criminal behavior. This perspective raises important questions about how society should handle individuals like Dahmer. While his crimes were unforgivable, the potential knowledge that could have been gained from studying his psychology might have helped prevent future tragedies. The tension between punishment and understanding remains a central debate in criminal justice. Dahmer's death in prison meant that any chance of gaining deeper insight into his psychological makeup was lost forever. Unlike some serial killers who spend decades in prison and provide researchers with ongoing opportunities to study their behavior and thinking patterns, Dahmer's case was essentially closed with his death. Although his criminal reign came to a tragic end, Dahmer's life was ultimately cut short less than 3 years into serving 15 consecutive life terms. His death represented a form of rough justice that many felt was appropriate, but it also marked the end of any possibility for deeper understanding of what had created such a monster. The manner of Dahmer's death, killed by another inmate in a brief, violent encounter, seemed almost inevitable given the nature of his crimes and his behavior in prison. It served as a final reminder that even within the controlled environment of maximum security incarceration, the consequences of his actions continued to follow him. As we reach the end of our journey through the life and crimes of Jeffrey Dahmer, we're left to grapple with uncomfortable questions that have no easy answers. How does someone become capable of such evil? What signs should we watch for? How many opportunities for intervention were missed along the way? The story of Jeffrey Dahmer is not just about one man's descent into depravity. It's a mirror that reflects broader failures in our society's ability to identify, understand, and address severe psychological disturbance before it manifests in violence. From his childhood fascination with dead animals to his final murder in 1991, Dahmer's life was marked by missed opportunities for intervention. The brief visit to the mental health facility that he abandoned after 15 minutes, the teachers who noticed his strange behavior but dismissed it as adolescent oddness, the probation officers who noted his depression and drinking but failed to connect these to deeper psychological issues. Each of these moments represents a chance that was lost, not just to save Dahmer from himself, but to save the 17 young men whose lives he would eventually take. The media coverage of Dahmer's crimes revealed its own set of failures. The initial reluctance to address the racial dimensions of his victim selection, the problematic use of terms like homosexual overkill, and the broader lack of diverse perspectives in newsrooms that led to important aspects of the story being overlooked or misunderstood. These journalistic shortcomings weren't just professional failures. They were manifestations of the same systemic issues that allowed Dahmer to continue killing for so long. The tendency to overlook or minimize violence against marginalized communities. The physical evidence found in Dahmer's apartment, the careful preservation of body parts, the methodical photography, the organized display of remains, revealed someone who had turned murder into an art form and necrophilia into a systematic practice. This wasn't random violence born of passion or desperation. It was calculated, methodical, and refined through repetition. Perhaps most disturbing was Dahmer's own explanation for his crimes. The desire to possess someone completely, to ensure they could never leave him. This psychological need for absolute control, combined with his inability to form normal human relationships, created a deadly combination that made murder seem like a logical solution to his emotional needs. The alternative perspective offered by my friend Dahmer reminds us that monsters aren't born fully formed. They develop over time, often in plain sight. The teenage Jeffrey Dahmer, who played in school bands and delivered newspapers, was the same person who would later drill holes in victims' skulls. Understanding this continuity is crucial to preventing future tragedies. Dahmer's death in prison, killed by another inmate just 2 years into his sentence, represented a form of rough justice, but also closed the door on any deeper understanding of his psychology. Unlike other serial killers who have provided researchers with decades of insight into their thinking patterns, Dahmer's case ended abruptly with his death. His former attorney's belief that Dahmer would have been better served in a psychiatric facility raises important questions about how we balance punishment with the potential for understanding. While Dahmer's crimes were unforgivable, the knowledge that might have been gained from studying his psychology could potentially have helped prevent future tragedies. The 17 victims of Jeffrey Dahmer were more than statistics. They were sons, brothers, friends, and lovers whose lives were cut short by one man's inability to see them as human beings worthy of life and dignity. Stephen Hicks, the hitchhiker seeking adventure. David Thomas, the father trying to support his daughter. Conarak Sintha Somphone, just 14 years old when his life was stolen. Each had dreams, fears, hopes, and relationships. Each left behind families who continue to grieve. In focusing on understanding Dahmer, we must never forget that the true tragedy lies in the lives that were lost and the families that were shattered by his actions. The story of Jeffrey Dahmer serves as a stark reminder of the importance of mental health awareness, early intervention, and the need for society to take seriously the warning signs of potential violence. It highlights the critical role of diverse perspectives in journalism and law enforcement, and the dangers of marginalizing vulnerable communities. Most importantly, it reminds us that evil is not some abstract force that exists independently of human choice and action. Jeffrey Dahmer made decisions, thousands of them, that led him down a path of increasing violence and depravity. At each step, different choices could have led to different outcomes. Understanding this doesn't excuse his actions or diminish their horror, but it does provide hope that through better awareness, earlier intervention, and more comprehensive support systems, future tragedies might be prevented. The name Jeffrey Dahmer will forever be associated with some of the most horrific crimes in American history. But if we can learn from his story, if we can use it to better identify and help troubled individuals before they become dangerous, then perhaps some meaning can be found in an otherwise senseless tragedy. Thank you for joining me on this difficult but necessary journey into one of the darkest chapters of criminal history. The questions raised by the Dahmer case remain relevant today, and our responsibility to address them continues.